This is an uncomfortable topic for a lot of people. So, if you're sensitive to these type of things, you have been warned. How fetishes and fixations develop in the human mind. It's almost always something negative, something traumatic, something overwhelmingly bad that your mind can't understand. It usually manifests in childhood because that is when your mind is developing, when you are vulnerable to others, and when you don't have an understanding. So more things are overwhelming because you just don't know what anything is. So if we take a look at nature, I remember being surprised by this the first time I realized it. Like everything in nature has post traumatic stress. Like look at a rabbit just standing there and it's shaking and it's listening for any noise and it jumps. It's hyper aware of its surroundings. Like I remember looking at one and being like, wow, that like it listens for stuff like I listen for stuff. Like it's ready. And I was like, wow. So like everything in nature is in shock. Seeing your siblings be eaten in front of your eyes is a pretty traumatic event, one would imagine. But in humans, these things take on different meanings. There's different ways of dealing with it because it's something that's so bad the human mind can't really understand. And if you've ever been on a boat, there's those little holes at the bottom on the deck. Like fetishes and fixations are like emotional overflow, something that the mind can't understand. So it runs off into these other areas that become these type of fixations because the mind just can't process it. And it's not always a one-to-one type thing where if you have somebody who likes getting choked, you can imagine at some point in their life, somebody who was like a caretaker or important emotionally to them was cutting off their air supply. That's a pretty safe bet. But a lot of them are not that one to one and they become symbolic. So, like with bondage, for example, you'll see a lot of people who they were controlled so much that they don't feel like their limbs are their own. I know this one girl from a very well to do family, was in a very fancy school, but every minute of her life was controlled by her parents. Even now, when she was out of their house and in college, the only time she had was when her parents thought she was asleep. And who's she hanging out with? Someone like me. Like, that always blew my mind. And she would tie her limbs to the point where they would lose blood flow. And she ultimately wanted her limbs amputated. That's what got her off. She wasn't going to amputate her limbs, but that's what got her off, is the idea of having her limbs amputated because she didn't feel like they were hers, from what I gather. Clowns is one I always wondered about. Like, how does clowns become a sexual fixation? Like, were their parents clowns? Were there like clowns on the wallpaper? Or, like, was there a doll and something terrible happened and you were staring at the doll? Like, how does that one happen? I never could figure that out. Feet, I theorize, and I don't know this, but I theorize people become fixated on feet because, like, when you're a kid, you're closer to people's feet. And, like, let's say that the parents are mostly neglectful, and the only time the kid bonds with the parents is when the child is sitting at the parents' feet. Therefore, like the feet would become like an expression of affection almost, or a symbol of affection. And then later in life, feet take on a sexual connotation because they are connected to the affection. And from what I understand, ultimately it is affection, like a child's affection, becomes their sexual expression as they become a teenager and adult. That's what I understand of it. Like, for instance, what I've read about diaper fixations is that that develops from never being held by the parent when they're infants. And the only soft thing that touches them is the diaper. Now, I read about this in a study. It was about animal abuse. Well, it was about human abuse, but these people were abusing animals to study human abuse. This is a very common thing that used to happen in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And what this study was we're going to take five, I don't remember if it was chimps or monkeys, but we're going to take five and they are going to be cared for and be loved and supported. And then we're going to take five and they will receive no contact. No one will touch them. They will receive no affection. We're going to see what happens to them. So, like, they constructed these, like, wire things, like a wire thing of a person, and they would put a bottle in it, and the thing would be put in it, the, the monkey, and that's like the closest it got to being held by someone is they would put them in these wire hangers, and all five of those monkeys ended up developing sexual fixations on their diapers. So they theorize that is where that comes from, is that you are neglected when you're an infant. um, I mean, it runs the gamut of human behaviors, but it interests me as to like the symbolic ones. Like, where did that develop out of? Cannibalism is one I always wondered about. Like, where did that come from? Did it come from some threat like a parent or caretaker would make? Like, I'm gonna bite you or something. Like, I knew this kid that had a castration fetish, and he said it was from his I think it was his grandmother would threaten to cut his dick off when he was young. um like, she wasn't really ever going to do it, but it's just something she said for whatever reason, I imagine because she was horribly traumatized in her life too. That's usually, these things are usually cycles of behavior in people, like the way they've been hurt, they hurt others, and that tends to be the order of the way things go. But like, it is always, I don't know any examples where it comes from something good. I've never heard of that. it's it's always something negative. Like, with myself, fear is one of the biggest things I feel a sexual connection to. Like, fear turns me on, and I would always put myself in these terrifying positions because I didn't realize it, but the fear quite literally turned me on. And I never understood when I was younger why I was forcing myself to do these things. And like, I wasn't, like I said, I was never a tough kid. I was never a violent kid. That would come later in life. But I was always finding myself in these positions where I was perpetually terrified because that's what I thought life should be. Like, everything should be fear all the time. Uh, because that's the way I had grown up when I was little. That's the way my teenage years had been. So, like, fear is just the way things are. And I couldn't even get sexually excited unless I was afraid of the person. And now, this isn't the same type of fear where it's like a fear that they're going to hit me, but like, their behavior is so unpredictable. That was like necessary to me getting sexually aroused by that person, is I had to have a certain degree of fear of them. And like, that's not a common one you're gonna see a lot, but it it's quite normal in my life. There's any time you see someone who has like an extraordinary behavior, and usually those type of things develop out of some type of coping mechanism for a sexual fixation. Like it's the way it is, unfortunately. Like that's the gruesome reality under things. Like I commonly see many politicians have a sexual fixation on controlling people. I'm not saying they all do. I'm sure some truly are like doing it out of a sense of benevolence and serving the people, but many of them are driven by having power over people. And that comes from a sexual compulsion. They are driven by this urge that's very profound in them, very deep, because otherwise there wouldn't be the motivation to do it. Like, that's a lot of effort. You have to feel that. You have to feel strongly about that. And usually that comes from some kind of fixation or fetish, and it's a way of making it socially acceptable. People will do that sometimes where they sexuality takes on another manifestation. They say Leonardo da Vinci, a lot of his work was because he could not act on his sexuality. So he transmuted that into, his work. And a lot of people, you will see that where they are workaholics because they have some aspect of their sexuality they can't deal with. So they are putting all their sexuality into that. I'm not saying that's the only reason people become workaholic. I'm saying sometimes you see it there. Anytime you have this behavior that's far outside the norm and it just is an incredible drive, usually it is some way of transferring a uncomfortable sexual fixation somebody has. Like that's from my experience and from what I understand of the human mind, that is often why these things develop. Not the only reason, but often. So, and it always comes from something negative. It doesn't have to be only be in childhood. Obviously, there are examples of things like rape and so forth that people experience later in life where it's like so overwhelming to them. Like they can't cope with it. So it goes to those emotional overflow stations, which when somebody can't cope with it, they end up developing sexual feelings around it as a way of getting through it, as a way of accepting what's happened to them. It becomes like something that turns them on, and that's the way the mind deals with it. And oftentimes that's why people are so adverse to hearing things like I'm saying about this, because it means they have to confront it in a way that they don't want to, and that can, trust me, I know how uncomfortable that is. um, but that tends to be how sexual fetishes and fixations develop in the human mind. Something very bad happens, it's overwhelming, you can't understand it, it's beyond the ability to understand. So it runs into these emotional overflow places, and in those places is the act gets sexualized. Sometimes it's symbolic, sometimes it's not, but from what I understand, these are the way these things develop. And you know, I'm not saying that's like the final word that needs to be written on that. You can close the book on this, but that is how it develops, why it develops, and like that's what it is. Take it for what it's worth.